Welcome everybody to 52 Living Ideas. Today is a very odd day. Normally we cover only topics in psychology, philosophy, and self-improvement. And I'm actually kind of sad and a little bit reluctant. So I've scheduled this topic, with considerable amount of sadness and reluctance because I didn't want to actually talk about. I'd never want to talk about, current politics. People get enough of it outside. But I think that I need to do this because I want to deal with it at I think the issues now are at a philosophical level where I think it is worth, we have to talk about it as Americans, as human beings. So I don't see any way of not talking about it. And that's why I've cheated and got my friend Rob Tracinski to do most of the talking. So what I'm going to do, I want to just give the introduction here. Firstly, about the rules. Because this is topic on current politics, and I don't know exactly how to produce really civil discourse on current politics. We do this, we do topics on all kinds of, fields, and we have amazingly deep discussions and respectful discussions. I really don't know how to do that in current politics. So I'm using far more stricter versions of the rules that I have. So here is what we're going to do. So I'm going to interview Rob on the topic of Trump versus the Constitution. After the interview, I'm going to take questions. And even during the interview, I can take questions. And the way I would take questions is that instead of doing it verbally, I'm going to take the questions through the chat. So if you want to ask questions, go ahead and put an exclamation mark and put your questions, and we'll get to your questions. Now, the bar is very high. Keep on topic. We're talking about the Constitution and the Trump versus the Constitution. That is the main issue. Do not digress into anything minor, anything petty. Okay, just let's keep on that. So keep on topic. That's one. Number two, be brief so that we can, get to your questions. And number three, be courteous. Okay, what we're trying to do, this is a serious matter, and I want to discuss it at the deepest possible level. So don't get distracted. No personal back and forths, insults or anything like that. We don't do that here. And I'm not going to do that just because I'm not going to tolerate it just because this is a current politics topic. All right. So
save the insults for Twitter.
Yes, that's right. That's right. All right. So let's get started. I also want to tell you that we are broadcasting live on YouTube, and we have a bunch of people watching on YouTube. And I'll take questions from YouTube as well. So because it is live, it is not going to be edited. I'm using a much higher level, higher standards than normal. All right. So with that, let me get started. I studied the great books, which is basically, this is work done by Mortimer Adler, University of Chicago, and Encyclopedia Britannica. And what they did was that they put together all the thinkers in the West, philosophers, scientists, novelists, historians, and they asked a very simple question, what do these people talk about? And so this is kind of compilation of all of Western thought. And one of the things that blew me away was that throughout the Western conversation, the ideal of a government has always been a benevolent king. Founding fathers are new. They are an exception. Before that, and even today, like most large part of the world, people kind of naturally gravitate towards wanting benevolent kings. So in that sense, the idea of America is very new. The idea of government of laws and not men is new. So what I want to do is I want to talk about that first. So, Rob,
Yeah.
I think it was Lord Acton who said, what I don't remember the exact quote. What was the exact quote?
Power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. Interestingly enough, he was actually writing, he was a Catholic, but he was actually writing about the Pope when he said that. And it was, I just found this out recently because, this quote gets thrown around. There's actually an Acton Institute out there, which is a sort of a small government conservative Catholic think tank. So they used Acton because he
But
was a
I
Catholic.
was thinking of another quote by him. He was saying
Oh,
that in 1776.
oh, liberty is that which was not until the last quarter of the 18th century in America.
Yes,
Yes.
yes, yes. See, I can always ask Rob for quotes, even when I don't remember them.
I don't remember them all the time, but that one I do know. Yes.
Okay, so let's talk about how different was America, because you've studied kind of history and politics a lot more than I have. So talk a little bit about what was different between how people thought about politics before America and how was how were founding fathers a departure from that?
Right. So the interesting thing is a lot of the foundational texts of what we consider to be modern government, in good or bad ways, we're still very much tied into this idea of the king and of the prerogative of the king and justifying the power or defining in some way the power of the king. So, for example, Thomas Hobbes, who's sort of the launching of the idea of the social contract and of the idea that, well, we have this life in the state of nature, but we agree to give up certain powers. He actually said give up certain rights, which is what made him different from Locke. But that you give up certain powers to the government in order to bring peace and tranquility, so that we could then have a better life. That was a justification for the power of a king. Similarly, I was interested to find out that Jean-Jacques Rousseau, his ideas are associated with the French Revolution and with the elimination of the king and the French, the chopping off the head of the king in the French Revolution. But his big cases for the social contract and for the will of the people were actually arguments in favor of the monarchy, in favor of specifically in favor, I think, of the power of the monarchy as someone who would represent all the people and the general will of the people over and above the aristocracy and keep the aristocracy in check. So it's amazing how that you see this a lot in history and even today, that there are certain ideas that are so embedded in people's brains that they can't look outside of them. They can't think to question them. That just seems so natural. And one of those ideas was the idea that you would have a king as the guy who's in charge. And so the fact is that it had rarely, if ever, been done that you didn't have a king in at least some form, like William of Orange, who of William and Mary, who became King of England in the Glorious Revolution of 1689. He was the elector of, I think, Hanover. That is, he was an elected monarch in Germany, in this area of Germany, but the elected monarchy was still, you had to be somebody who was a royal blood. And once you were elected, it was sort of considered normal that you would stay in office. And so it had a lot of the royal prerogatives that made it sort of semi-elected. It was more like, it was more of a benign dictator kind of, or a benign monarch was the ideal. Or in the, there were very, very, very small number of examples of republics that had been formed at various times in European history. And there were still elements of aristocracy. And, the Doge of Venice was basically sort of an elected prince. So there were still elements of, you had elements of election in there that provided some checks on the monarch, but he was still, essentially, it was the model of a benevolent monarch. And so, and then also most of those other experiments, by the way, had been very, very small, and often had not lasted very long, which is why it was considered sort of radical for them to say, we're going to do this and we're going to make it stick. We're going to make this work. I think there's a fortuitous circumstance that George Washington didn't have any sons, because there were people even in the 18th century. I mean, Alexander Hamilton briefly he sort of worshipped Washington, and had been Washington's right-hand man, and his fortunes had risen with Washington. So it was clear he had a certain interest in saying, he floated the idea of let's make Washington king. And it's probably a good thing that Washington didn't have any sons, didn't have any children, because there would have been this sort of presumption that let's pass on the virtue of this great man would pass on to his kids. I think you still see that in today's politics and in semi-democratic politics across the world, that there's often a clan leader. I mean, in Pakistan, you have the Bhutto clan, and you have various different people who are Lebanon is a great example of this, where you have these different, these bunch of different factions, and it tends to be the tribal leader of whatever your faction is who ends up being elected to the big positions. And you see that in America, where you have the Kennedy family, which finally has sort of petered out completely. You had the Clintons, you had the Bushes. And there's a temptation behind it. It's not just raw tribalism. It's also the fact that when you're choosing a leader, you have the task of trying to find somebody who's going to be virtuous, somebody who's going to behave in the right way, somebody who's going to have the right values. And the sort of tempting shortcut on that is, well, we know what he stands for. He's a Kennedy. We know what he stands. What kind of leader he's going to be. He's a Bush. And that people use this as almost a heuristic, as a mental shortcut to try to figure out who somebody is and what they stand for and what kind of leader they're going to be. Go ahead.
So, I mean, one of the things that I like about founding fathers is that they understood this about human beings, that there is this, on one hand, there is an wanting amongst people of having a leader. And on the other hand, leaders, when they have power, they want to hold on to it.
And virtue turns out not to be inherited, as look at the Kennedys, that sort of thing. Yeah.
Yes. But the thing that I find really remarkable is people like James Madison. So let's talk about Madison, because he's like the best example I know of founding fathers who kind of systematically tried to design a system that impeded this kind of behavior, this kind of wanting in people or in leaders. So, so let's talk about this system that was designed, that founding fathers designed. Mostly, I think Madison had a lot to do with it, but there is lots of people who contributed to that. So, what kind of system that they built? What is the system that they built to impede this kind of action?
Oh, that's such a wide question. I think the main thing was creating a separation that's the idea of separation of powers. And that's something that had been developed to a certain level in British government, in English government, that with the rise of the Parliament over many centuries, the idea of parliamentary power being separate from the royal power and the Parliament being in a way a check on the king. But it only had been taken, about 3/4 of the way, or maybe 2/3 of the way in the British system. And that they took it the next step. One of the most interesting things examples of that, I think, is the system of advice and consent. So the idea that and this was very much based on the English experience. This is the idea that the top ministers, the top cabinet officials, the very top level of officials appointed by the president have to be approved of by the Senate. So he nominates them, and then he gets the advice and consent of the Senate, meaning he needs their approval. And that was something that was based on the English tradition, because the English realized, or had begun to realize in the years leading up, in the centuries leading up to this, that the king is just one man. There's only so much he can do by himself. He acts by means of, through his ministers, his various agents that he has. And so they realized that if we can control the ministers of the king, then we can control the king. And eventually they take that all the way and have a prime minister, who's the main minister appointed to the king, who actually holds all the power, which is the system, of course, they have now. They hadn't quite gotten there in the late 18th century. They were on their way. So this idea, but the British never quite took the idea all the way, because then they had the prime minister, once he got all the power, was part of parliament. He was a member of parliament, elected by the members of parliament. And so you sort of had all the powers in parliament. He was part of the part, you know, it was sort of the representative of parliamentary supremacy. But the idea of saying, let's take the Congress and make it separate from the president and give them all sorts of checks and controls over the president, including things like, you know, we get to determine who he gets to appoint to all these jobs. And you know, what that effect that tends to have is that he ends up having to appoint people who are well-known, who have good reputations, who have a career and a history that's independent of the president. And so he gets people who are less his just lackeys who are doing whatever he wants, and people who have some sort of reputation and interests that go beyond him. And because, you know, the Congress is going to want to see him appoint somebody who they know, who they have trust in. So, and usually it ends up meaning somebody who has been a secretary or something before, somebody who has been a senator, somebody who's been a congressman. So somebody who's a known quantity in politics. And that is, it's a limitation on the power of the president. We can see that right now because, and this is one thing, one of the horses I wanted to beat here, is that one of the sort of low-level scandals in the Trump administration is that a lot of the stuff is being done in this administration by acting secretaries. So this is where he got rid of a cabinet secretary, or the cabinet secretary retired or resigned or was fired, and he filled the space with an acting secretary. And the idea is you can have acting secretary who takes over while the new appointee is going through Senate confirmation, but then Trump never bothered with the Senate confirmation. And he talked about how I like the word acting. It means that I have more influence over them. You know, because an acting secretary is somebody who exists purely, serves purely at Trump's pleasure, and is purely answers only to him and has not answered to the Senate or the Congress at all. And so, for example, right now, the Department of Homeland Security, Chad Wolf, who's there, is the acting head of the Department of Homeland Security, has been for more than a year. There was a court ruling recently that said he's actually not the legitimate head of the Department of Homeland Security, which was then promptly ignored. So we basically have a system where this system of having the legislature have checks on the president is basically being ignored and breaking down simply through sort of obstinate refusal to comply with it. The other big thing that they did is the idea of giving the power of the purse. And this is, again, based totally in English history. The Power of the Purse. So English history is a great book. I think either you or Jack gave it to me, called Property and Freedom by Richard Pipes. And he goes over this whole history about how the power of the English king was basically reined in by using the power of the purse. That what happened is originally the king was supposed to live on his own. I think it's either on or from, live on his own, meaning he's supposed to live off of the revenues from his own lands. And this was very easy early on because the king owned, the vast tracts of land within England. It was easy for him to live off of the revenue of that. This is, after the Norman conquest, the king had claimed such vast areas of land that he had huge amounts of revenues. He could hire an army. He could do whatever he wanted to with the revenues from those lands. But of course, what happens is, I just said, virtue isn't inherited, right? Mm-hmm. So you have the subsequent kings come along and they're wasteful with their spending. They start unnecessary wars. They run out of money. And every time they run out of money from their own lands, they then have to go back to everybody else and say, well, okay, we need to raise some money. And they have to go back to Parliament and ask for them to start a new tax and raise more money for the king in some way. And every time they do that, what happened is, over a period of centuries, every time they would do that, the Parliament would say, well, great, you want more money, we could probably do that, but we want some prerogatives, we want some reforms, we want some more power for us in exchange for that money. And that all came to a head in 1689 when they brought William of Orange over. The deal that the Parliament made with William of Orange was, look, we'll put you and Mary on the throne. We'll get rid of James. Was it James II? Yeah. We'll get rid of James. I get confused sometimes about Jameses and Charles. Uh, but we'll get rid of the tyrannical king. We'll put you on the throne, and we'll give you a stipend. We'll give you an allowance that comes out of the revenue of Parliament. And that's the point at which basically the English king became a creature of Parliament, answerable to Parliament, because they were paying the bills, including the bills for the army, the bills for his various government officials, and the bills for even for his own household. And that was the way in which the English government had reined in the power of the king. And so the power of the purse, being with the House of Representatives, being with Congress, is another major way in which they constructed a system where the powers of the president are not unlimited. But the big thing I wanted to say about this, though, we could talk about other different ways they did that. But one of the things is that a lot of this, especially like I just mentioned, the acting secretaries, a lot of this depends on a certain amount of voluntary compliance. It depends on the fact that there are sort of norms and mores, there are moral expectations on the president, and that if he breaks those and goes against those, he's afraid of public opinion. And he's afraid that he will lose public opinion if he goes too far. Now, obviously, what's happened is we've been breaking that down a lot over more than a century. With Wilson and Roosevelt and all these different things. Roosevelt, for example, breaking the taboo, the custom of never running for office for more than 2 terms, that the example that Washington had set. So we've been breaking down all these things. And specifically, as we've increased the size of government, we've given more and more power to the executive, because to manage this vast Leviathan state, it needs to have a lot more of its, the executive needs a lot more unilateral power to create regulations and to declare states of emergency and things like that. So the more power the government's gotten, the more these things have been broken down. And that leads us, I think, to where Donald Trump, rather than sort of ratcheting that back, with one exception that I can get to later if you want, with the exception of ratcheting that back, has basically said, great of you guys to create all this unchecked executive power for me. Now let me go use it.
What is that one exception?
The one exception is regulation, and specifically global warming, but also regulation in general. So the one thing that, from a constitutional perspective, just purely from a constitutional perspective, one thing good that he's done is that he has vastly decreased the pace of new regulation. Now, I want to talk about why that's a constitutional issue, because what's happened is we have this doctrine that really goes back to, in earnest, it started with Woodrow Wilson and with this idea of an administrative state. So there's this doctrine that was brought in of delegated power. So Congress has the power to create all legislation, meaning all rules that the executive it creates all the rules that the executive is enforcing. But Congress basically said, well, as they started creating this vast Leviathan state that was doing a lot more things, they said, well, it's too cumbersome for Congress to create all these rules. And for us to rule on what drugs should be permitted by the FDA, and for us to rule on what's good and bad under the Clean Air Act, et cetera. So we're going to delegate that power to Congress, to the executive branch agencies. So the Department of Energy or the FDA or this or that executive agency, they will make those decisions. They'll basically they'll be interpreting the intent of Congress in order to make this vast system of new rules, essentially making legislation in the executive branch under the rubric of just applying some overall vague law that Congress created. And there's an incentive that gets wrapped up in this, because the Constitution was all about balancing incentives and making sure that the incentives of, Madison relied on the idea that the Congress, that the legislature would have an interest in maintaining its own privileges and its own powers, and would jealously guard them against encroachment by the executive. And the one way I can think of where that really has broken down is with this administrative state, where the interests of Congress became to do exactly what they do now, which is people love clean air. So let's pass a law called the Clean Air Act, and we can tell everybody we're in favor of clean air, and that's very popular. What's not popular is all the pettifogging rules and regulations you have to impose on people in order to interpret this and to apply this act in all of its little details. That's cumbersome, it's time consuming, and it might be unpopular. So we don't want to do that. So we'll slough that off to the executive. And what we have now, I think increasingly, is a system where the Congress is there sort of for show. They're there to grandstand and talk about things, but not pass that much legislation that really makes a difference. And they've given all this power to the executive branch agencies to actually impose, tens of thousands of new regulations a year to implement all these things, which is being done without any particular check by Congress. Same thing, they did the same thing with emergency powers. It was very popular to say, on free trade, it's interesting. On free trade, I did an interview on this a while back with Scott Linscomb, where one of the things a pro-free trade guy with Cato Institute, and one of the things he talked about was there was this idea that actually giving the president emergency powers over trade was actually considered a pro-free trade view. Because the idea was if Congress makes all the rules on trade, they're going to be tempted to pander to their constituents. And in Pennsylvania, the congressmen from Pennsylvania are going to want to protect the steel industry, and the people in North Carolina are going to protect textiles, and in Iowa they're going to want to protect the farmers, et cetera. It says, let's take all that away from us. Let's give it to the president. But at the time, there was the idea that the presidency was generally more pro-free trade. This is the post-World War II era. The presidency was generally more pro-free trade. So they said, we'll give these emergency powers to Congress. So we can say, well, look, it would go back to our constituents and say, we gave the president emergency powers, so he could be really tough on this if he wants to be, but free in the assumption that he's not going to use that power. Now, of course, Donald Trump comes along and uses the power. And that comes back to the thing that I think is the one good thing he's done is outside of trade, he has really not exercised the regulatory power and has slowed it down to a very slow pace. Mm-hmm. Now, the caveat on that is that he hasn't really changed the system. He's just decided, I'm not going to impose regulations because I don't like them personally. Okay. But he hasn't gone to Congress. He hasn't asked for any fundamental reforms in the way the system is created. So that will bounce back. So the minute he decides an issue is important and wants to impose a regulation on it, he can do whatever he wants. Mm-hmm. And once he leaves office, if Joe Biden mm-hmm. gets into office after him, which it looks likely now, all those regulations, the floodgates can open on the regulations again. Mm-hmm. So it's not really a constitutional reform. It's just a forbearance on using the powers that he has.
So you've been talking about this creep of expansion of executive authority. To me, Trump's statement that he's refusing to commit to leave, peaceful transition of power. That was in a completely different category. How do you see that? Where do you place that in the context of American history? Yeah.
Yeah, I do think you're right. This is a very unusual thing. It really, it's the biggest constitutional crisis probably since, I'd have to think about it a little bit more if there are other counterexamples, because, me, I'm very much against golden ageism, that, everything used to be perfect and now it's rotten. Because there's all sorts of horrible things that happened in the past history. And, we talk about partisanship, the party politics of the 1790s was way more vicious even than we have today. But I do think that it's true that this is something that hasn't happened really since the Civil War. The Civil War obviously was a bigger one because everything broke down and we actually had a civil war. There was no peaceful way to resolve it. But the idea that what really caused the Civil War was the fact that the southern states were unwilling to accept the election of an anti-slavery politician as president. I think it was partly that was the writing on the wall to them that the anti-slavery forces had gained the majority in the country and everything was just going to get worse for them from there on out. But they basically said, if Lincoln is elected, we're not even going to be in the Union. So this is the ultimate example of not accepting the results of an election, way more than anything we're talking about here. But I think since then, this is the one that strikes me as the strongest, the idea of saying, I'm not going to commit to the peaceful transition of power. You can talk about the way the question was worded, but it's a basic thing that if you are president of the United States and somebody asks you, will you commit to the peaceful transfer of power? You say yes, right? That's the first thing you say. You can add qualifications like, well, we might we might not concede on the first day. We might want a recount of things. We reserve the right to challenge the vote in a particular state if we think there's the votes still need to be counted, et cetera. You can, all of that sort of thing. But the first thing you say is, yes, we will accept the results. Now, what I think people are going after the fact that he said, well, we'll have to see, is what he said, that he left it up in the air whether to accept the peaceful transfer of power. But the thing that he immediately pivoted to, and this is what I think was really going on here, is he immediately pivoted to going on about the ballots. And what he meant by that is the mail-in ballots. And this is something he's been doing for about 4 months now, is a steady drumbeat of saying mail-in ballots are fraudulent, inherently fraudulent. The whole system is fraudulent, and it's the way the Democrats are going to try to steal the election. Now, by the way, we've done mail-in ballots in this country, across the country for a long time. This is not a new thing. It has never been a significant factor in terms of fraud or in terms of tipping an election. And I also think that, in the middle of a pandemic, we're going to have a larger number of mail-in ballots, but we should be encouraging that, obviously, in the middle of a pandemic, so we don't have people, standing close to each other and contracting diseases. We're going into a fall in which we're likely to have a bounce back of coronavirus. We want to encourage people not to be crowding into the polls. We want them to vote by mail. But what he's been doing is creating the steady drumbeat of the idea that voting by mail is inherently corrupt and unreliable. And he seems to be setting the groundwork. And that's what he was really saying here, is he's setting up the groundwork for the idea that he doesn't have to accept. And that's what he's saying. He's not going to necessarily accept the transfer of power. He's setting up the idea that I don't have to accept the mail-in ballots as legitimate. And the reason that's going to create a crisis, or could potentially create a crisis, is that when election day comes, it's not going to be election day this year, right? So we're used to it never was intended to be, at the time of the framers, the idea that election, the votes would take weeks to count, because you had people coming in from all around. The vote count was tallied in each county and had to be taken literally, by horse to the state capitals, and then by horse to a central location. So the idea that it would take a long time for the vote to be counted was normal. We, of course, in the 20th century and into the 21st century, we've gotten used to the idea that it'll be called by 11 p.m. Right? It's partly because of the poll. You have polling where they do exit polls and they project who's going to win, and they've gotten that to be very accurate. And it's partly because you have telephones and you can have vote counting machines and all that sort of thing. So typically you can get the whole 120 million people voting, and typically you can get a pretty clear answer the night of. I've had to stay up until fairly late at night a couple of times waiting for it, but you get it within 8 hours or so of the polls closing. With the number of mail-in ballots we're getting, it's highly likely that there's going to be at least a few close races where we're not going to have that result on election night, where they're going to still be counting the mail-in ballots, and that's going to be a very significant percentage of the total. And that will create this ambiguity where if Trump is ahead in the votes that have been counted, that night on the traditional election day period, if he's ahead there, but there's a large number of ballots, mail-in ballots, still yet to be counted, which are probably going to go against him, it creates this ambiguity that he can say, well, I'm ahead and they're trying to steal it with these fraudulent, illegitimate mail-in ballots. And then there's evidence, and this is what prompted that question to him at the press conference. There has been evidence that that the Trump team has been sounding out state legislatures for the idea that, well, if the mail-in ballots are still being counted, we could just go ahead and have you certify appoint the electors and certify the vote in favor of Donald Trump and appoint the electors before all the mail-in ballots are counted. Because we can't wait that long, and that's just, they're fraudulent and they're going to steal the vote. So we want you to lock it in for Donald Trump. So the possibility is that Donald Trump could attempt, and I say it's a possibility, but it's not just speculation. He's clearly laying the groundwork for it with this rhetoric about there's a giant, I'm in my cellar, there's a giant spider running around here. He occasionally sets me off. If he gets close enough, I'll just stomp on him. So he's creating the groundwork for the idea that I can challenge the mail-in ballots, and I can dismiss those as fraudulent if they're going against me. And the fact that that the party's actually gaming that out and trying to lay the groundwork for it, and he's laying the rhetorical groundwork for it. And that's, I think, what's frightening about this. Now, there's a lot more detail to that if you want me to go into it, because there's a lot of interesting stuff that's actually not quite in the Constitution. It's the implementation of how elections are done.
Please do, because it's good to know about it now.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
So part of it is just the political science of it, which is that historically the mail-in ballots and absentee ballots didn't make much difference in the outcome because they were evenly weighted. So the idea is, if you had 3% of the ballots were absentee ballots or mail-in ballots that were counted at the end. In theory, they might be able to tip the election, but in practice, they were generally 50-50, almost 50-50 for Republican versus Democrat. So the mail-in ballots didn't make a difference. So what's happened in the past 10 years or so is a gap has begun to open up. And nobody's really quite sure why, but a gap has begun to open up where day of in the poll live person voting has been a little more Republican, and mail-in ballots and absentee ballots have been a little more Democratic. And that's expected to, that gap is, now nobody knows for sure, but that gap is expected to widen considerably this year because Donald Trump has spent, the last 6 months or so telling a lot of his supporters, COVID's not a big deal. You should be out and about. We shouldn't be doing these mail-in ballots. They're fraudulent. So Trump voter is going to be much more likely to show up live at the polls on that day. Whereas a Democratic voter, they've been told this is deadly. We need to have lockdowns. You shouldn't be going anywhere. And you should definitely be requesting your mail-in ballot. So there's the expectation here that you're going to have, and the term for it, somebody uses the red mirage. Now, somehow somebody let the networks get away with calling the right of center party red. Now, I'm a creature of the 20th century, and I grew up in the Cold War. So, the idea that we're the Reds kind of offends me. But anyway, they decided that the red states and the red voters are the Republicans. So this is the idea of the red mirage, that what you'll have is the in-person voting will make Donald Trump's performance in a state look much better than it really is. And then that will go away as the mail-in votes and absentee ballots are counted. So that gap creates a problem. Now, that is the engine of the thing. That's sort of what sets it off. Then what the details of this have to do with something that's called sometimes the interregnum, right? We've just talked about kings and monarchical rule. Well, interregnum means between reigns, so the one king has died and one king is gone and the new king hasn't quite come in. Well, in American politics, the interregnum is the period between election day and inauguration day. Where you have a new president in waiting, but he doesn't actually get sworn in for a couple of months, about 2 months, about 2.5 months. And the thing is, there's lots of stuff that happens in that interregnum. And typically we don't notice that stuff very much. The last time we really paid much attention to it was the year 2000, right? With the hanging chads and the recount. But that was just a recount in a couple of counties down in Florida. But so there's a whole process, and I've linked to a long article in The Atlantic. It's long. It's a very long and very detailed, and it's a little alarmist in a couple spots. So I want to sort of put it out there, but it's very good at spelling out all the steps of the interregnum. So there's a point at which the legislatures, the ballots are being counted, and the legislatures take the ballot count and certify it and appoint the electors. So by about a month after Election Day, they appoint the electors, who are then going to go off to the Electoral College. And then the Electoral College, in mid-December, the Electoral College meets and casts its votes. And then the results from the Electoral College are sent to Congress. And then I think it's typically the new Congress, the new House of Representatives that's just been elected, that then receives that information and basically formally accepts the vote, who the new president is. Well, so that's a process that goes on for about 2 months or so prior to the president, to Inauguration Day. And there's multiple points at which this system could fail if somebody were really trying to make it fail. If people, I said, we have a brilliant system with these moving parts that all work very well together. If people accept the spirit of it and try to make it work. But one of the beauties, I think, of the Constitution is it's relatively short. It's not a very long document. It states things in very large and general terms, and then there's lots of details that have to go in to implementing it. And I think they made a good decision not to specify all those details. But what it means is that the details are still there, and the people who are creating those details and managing those details have to do it with the right spirit to keep the system working. And that's why I think that's why Trump's statement shocks you, because what keeps the system going is not just the Constitution. It's not just the laws that implement the Constitution. It's also a series of sort of, I would call it civic rituals. It's like, so this article I'm talking about talks about one of the civic rituals of the interregnum. And it's something, again, we don't notice because it always happens, but what if it doesn't happen? And that is one of the rituals of the interregnum is that typically the custom is the presidential candidate who loses the election makes a personal phone call or personal visit to the winner to concede in person. Calls them up and say, congratulations on your victory. I concede that you've won. And then what generally happens is that the loser of the election gives a concession speech first. And only after the loser has given his concession speech does the winner give his acceptance speech. And this is one of these, I think year 2000 with Bush versus Gore is the only time that has happened. It was all over before the electors met. And one of the things somebody pointed out is that Gore had other legal options he could have pushed. He pushed him to a certain point and then dropped it and let it go because partly because public opinion had turned against him for keeping on, and also because it would have been destructive. But so there are all these little civic rituals that happen, all of which are meant to sort of underscore this idea of the spirit of the system and everybody acting to help make the system work instead of everybody acting to undermine the system. So that little thing about how the loser concedes first, and then the winner has his victory speech, is a little thing of basically saying that this system works because the winner and the loser are both willing to accept the results and willing to work together to help bring the country together around whoever is the legitimate winner of the election. Okay. It's sort of like the losing party in the election has an active role to play in helping people to accept the winner, including his own supporters to accept the winner. It's kind of remarkable when you think about it in retrospect that partly for this reason, Barack Obama entered office in 2009 at his inauguration with like an 80% approval rate, right? And it's remarkable when you consider how little approval he had especially from Republicans later on, and even beforehand. A lot of people didn't like him, but because of these civic rituals, the idea is the president enters with a high approval rate on his day of inauguration. And of course, it's all downhill from there because then he starts doing things that make people mad. But it's in a way, it's a good thing that he does, that he enters on inauguration day with high approval, because that's the result of these civic rituals that are there to get the losing side of the election to accept that. And that's why I think it's so shocking that Trump would say, well, we'll see, and I'll keep you in suspense on whether he'll accept the transition of power, because one of those civic rituals is the idea that the president, now it's not usually asked because it doesn't normally have to be asked, but one of the civic rituals is that, each side accepts, oh, we have a peaceful transfer of power that's important in this country. We always, and each person has a signal, I will do my part to make sure that an orderly transition happens.
Let me ask the hypothetical question.
Sure.
Let's say the Trump administration pushes one of the battleground states where both the legislatures are Republican to say that, okay, go ahead and yes, the mail-in ballots are still coming in, but go ahead and certify me, just choose electors. What do you think the state, how are the state legislatures going to react to such a thing? Because they too have to talk, they too have to, you know, talk to their people. They can't just do. So what do you think the reaction would be of the
Well, I
state
think, yeah.
legislature?
All right. So one of the things you were talking about, how the system is created, the constitutional system was created to help rein in the power of the king and prevent abuses of power. And federalism is a huge aspect of that. That's another aspect that comes in here, which is that a lot of aspects of voting, qualifications for voting, rules for voting, how electors are appointed. There's, I think Maine still has one of the few states that still has appoints electors by district. So in most states, it's a winner-take-all system, where if you have 29 electoral votes, whoever has a majority of the vote gets all 29. Maine is one of the few states that says, no, we're going to set it differently, that if you win this district, you get the elector from that district. But if the other guy wins this other district, he gets the elector from that district. So they break up their electoral votes. Or it's possible to break up their electoral votes. But the states have this huge role in the voting system in terms of setting the rules, setting the procedures, having laws about how all those procedures are done, what the qualifications are for voting, et cetera. Sometimes that's been abused. The Jim Crow laws created restrictions of voting that were intended to keep a whole class of people from being able to vote. And the federal government had to limit that. But generally speaking, that's a good thing that the states are involved, because a state legislature is going to have a very different incentive, and possibly a better incentive, because they're going to have to answer to their people about this. And that depends on the extent to which the sort of Trumpism and the Trump sort of cult of personality aspect that he's cultivated, where his interests and the interests of the Republican Party and the interests of the right in general are one and the same. The extent to which that's penetrated down to the state legislature level, my impression is it hasn't had enough time to fully do that. So I think there's a very good chance that if there's this push to say, you certify the vote, and the state legislator, your local state legislator is looking at that and saying, well, I'm a Republican, but if I do this, I could really be in trouble. I could get voted out. This can get hung around my neck and I can get voted out next year. This is something that they are, or even if he just says, I don't want to be remembered that way, I don't want this to be my political legacy, you could end up seeing that effort fall flat. So this is still kind of an outside possibility, I want to say. So the fact that this could actually happen is an outside possibility for a couple of reasons. One is you have to go through the state legislatures, and they very well may balk at it because their interests are not necessarily 100% tied up in supporting or opposing Donald Trump. But there's also the fact that, it depends on the fact that you're going to have a significant number of states, or a decisive number of states, where you have the vote be narrow enough split there, that it would make a difference for Trump to question the mail-in ballots and try to get the mail-in ballots not to be counted. So it depends on a relatively narrow set of circumstances. Now, it's a real possibility in a couple of states. But right now, it's looking, I would say it's not the greatest probability. Everybody talks about the polls being off in 2016. The polls were completely wrong. They didn't predict Donald Trump. Well, if you looked at it closely, if you looked at the polls, and I'm going to post on my newsletter in the near future some great information on this from Real Clear Politics, which does these polling averages, has lots of great information. If you look at the swing states in 2016, Hillary Clinton had a lead in the swing states, but her lead, as we got closer to the election, her lead went down and down and down, and was about 1 to 1.5% lead in a bunch of the crucial swing states. And of course, those are the ones that Trump ended up winning, and that was the big upset in the election. So it wasn't that the polls are wrong, but the polls have an error, a margin of error. And so what happened is that her lead got small enough that it was within the margin of error. Now, that's not so much the case for Trump, because right now Joe Biden has, now we're going to have a debate Tuesday night and that could change things, but it's been very stable across a lot of different events, even through the conventions and coronavirus and all of that. It's been very stable that Joe Biden has about a 7% lead nationally, but in a bunch of the key swing states, he has a lead of between like 2 and 5 or 6%. So it's big enough to be sort of outside the margin of error, so that the likelihood that this somewhat unlikely outcome could happen is much, much smaller than it was 4 years ago. So we're still talking about a very sort of minority probability of there being this fight where you have the electors are appointed by the state legislature that may not match up with the popular vote as it eventually comes in through the mail-in vote. And then you have the later stages of this, of what if you have the executive officials in a state give one result and dictate which electors should be appointed, and you have another slate of electors put forward by the legislature. I mean, you get these crazy things that could happen because of various vaguenesses or loopholes in the law, where you get to the point. One of the outcomes somebody came up with was, if the right circumstances happen, there would be no winner would be chosen in the House of Representatives. And through the default of finding a winner in the House of Representatives, Nancy Pelosi would become president, which I think everybody could agree is the worst possible outcome. Probably Nancy Pelosi would agree with that too. I don't think anybody wants the presidency under those circumstances. So the point of this all is that this is an incredibly complex system. A total failure of it, or a prominent failure of it, is the unlikely hypothesis. But it is a possibility that's hanging over us. It could actually happen. And it's the thing I think we have to worry about is the breakdown of the civic rituals, the breakdown of the attitude behind it, of each side being committed to making that system work.
Now, let me see. Can you point to other, we looked at this as a particularly egregious example of possible violation of, kind of usurpation of power by the executive. Are there other examples? You kind of started talking about Trump doing this in other areas. So at the constitutional level, what are the other actions that you see as being particularly detrimental to the Constitution?
All right. So the other big one that I think it's one that I think is the biggest, because hardly anybody else is talking about it. It's one that flies under the radar and therefore sets an even worse precedent, right? Because if the president does something bad and everybody's angry about it, that's not as bad as if the president does something bad and people don't notice, right? Because if the people don't notice, then the next president's going to say, I can do that too. And that's the one about the acting secretaries, about basically making the cabinet system break down. This is something I criticize. Like I said, most of these things are not new with Trump. They're things that previous presidents have sort of pushed at in various ways. And he's just taking them farther than anybody else. I've read an article once where I said, Donald Trump is like every other politician, only more so. And that's his problem. So Barack Obama, I criticized him a lot for this, because his way of going around the cabinet system was by having czars. So he'd appoint a healthcare czar, or a Middle East peace process czar. And a czar was, it's this term that goes back to the Carter administration, I think. But it's an executive official, sort of he's an advisor. He's not a cabinet official. He's not somebody with a particular place in the structure of government. He's just an advisor to the president, a personal advisor to the president, who is given a portfolio to deal with some major issue. And you can see how this is like a way to create an end run around the cabinet system, because instead of having to go through the cabinet officer, who is an experienced, somewhat independent politician who has had to be approved by Congress, he's picking just a flunky. He's picking somebody who is appointed by him and answerable only to him, a personal advisor to him, somebody who works in the most direct possible way to him, appointing that person as the person who's in charge of implementing a program or deciding on a program. And you can see how that breaks down the cabinet system, because it's an attempt to say, I get my own people doing everything and they answer only to me. And I don't have to go through the, maybe I go through the approval process to get the figurehead guy who's holding the office, but the guy I've actually appointed to do things is one of my advisors who answers only to me. So you get this sort of breaking down of the cabinet system. And that's something that Obama tried to do a lot of. The other thing is rule by executive order. And this is, again, like I said, it's all been done by previous presidents. Obama did a lot of this. I mean, I think one of the great ironies here is that, Obama schemed relentlessly to increase the power of and authority of the executive. And nobody thought, well, maybe a guy we don't like is going to get that power. People tend not to think ahead on that. And so one of the things is that, it's sort of a normal thing that presidents tend to do late in their term in office. Because what happens is late in their term in office, they have relatively little political capital. Oftentimes they're facing a hostile Congress, a Congress that's at least in part controlled by the other party that doesn't want to do anything. So their legislative agenda has died. They can't really push anything forward in terms of their legislative priorities. So they start looking around and saying, well, what can I do? Because people want to see me doing stuff. And I want to make sure I get as much of my agenda for my people as possible. So they say, well, wait, I've got all this executive power. Let's start using that. And what they also, the temptation is they say, let's use that as a leverage against Congress. And so Barack Obama used to talk, especially about immigration. He says, if Congress won't act, I will. So the threat is, I want Congress to pass this certain piece of legislation. And to pressure them to do it, I'm going to hold out the threat that I'll just do what I want anyway through executive order without them, and they won't get to have any say in it whatsoever. So it's an attempt to sort of to use this immense power that's been foolishly given away to the executive by previous Congresses to basically browbeat the current Congress into doing whatever he wants. And Trump has very much been active in using this idea of executive power, unilateral executive power. I think the biggest issue, the most notable issue he did that is on the issue of trade, where he basically said, I have the power to declare emergencies, and therefore I can put all these tariffs on Canadian goods and Mexican goods and Chinese goods and whatever else I want. I can put all these tariffs on them using this emergency power, and I could just, have a guy in the Commerce Department make a declaration that this is necessary, and that's it. That's all I need to do. No other further approval is necessary. But and to show how that power can be abused, I think a good example is the TikTok deal. Now, show of hands here, because I can see some of you. Who here has ever actually heard of TikTok before? I got one hand. I think I'm sure Shrikant has. He's
Yes.
Okay, so the reason you haven't heard about it is it's what the kids are doing these days instead of what grown adults are doing. So it's a social media service. I guess it's similar to what Vine used to be. It's these very short videos, but it's sort of like Instagram and Twitter and all this. It's a social media platform that's short videos that is apparently wildly popular among teenagers and like 20-year-old kids. It was developed by a Chinese company, and that created a problem because, first of all, this thing is gathering tremendous amounts of data on its users, and potentially monitoring its users and gathering data on them. The basic qualm that we have with every social media company, except unlike Facebook, this is not an American company. It's not a private company in America. It's a Chinese company, and therefore a creature of the Chinese government. We have very specific evidence of this. That basically the Chinese government gives orders to TikTok. It says it will execute those orders. It will give them whatever data they want. It will support or promote or squelch anything they don't want to get out. And that's the other thing. So that TikTok has all this data, user data. It also has an algorithm. And the algorithm is this mathematical formula that when you've watched one video, recommends more videos to you. And apparently they have a highly effective algorithm. That's why it's become so popular, is that they're really good at feeding people that next other thing that you want based on what you've already watched. But that algorithm is controlled by China. And so the concern there is that what if, for example, they want to promote a lot of stories about the election being rigged, to increase, the Chinese government wants to increase the unrest and conflict in America. They want to promote a lot of stories about the election being rigged. They can do that. What if they want to suppress any criticism of China or of the concentration camps for the Uyghur Muslims in China, et cetera? If they want to suppress any bad news about China or bad news about somebody else that they like, they have control over the algorithm. They can do that. So this was brought up. Now, this may be overblown, but this was brought up as a national security concern, that how do we allow this giant media company to come in? That's where the content is dictated by literally a censorship bureau within a totalitarian government. So Trump used this to say, okay, I'm going to invoke these various regulatory powers I have and trade powers I have, and force TikTok to sell off its American branch to American companies, or at least partly to American companies, so that this will be in control of good old American companies. So we will get rid of that role that the Chinese Communist Party has behind it. Well, what he did instead was he ended up brokering this deal where it was going to be sold to Oracle. And people say, well, why Oracle? Well, the founder of Oracle and the CEO, Larry Ellison, is a major Trump donor and a big Trump supporter. So there's the whispering that, that influence was in there, and that's why Microsoft didn't get the deal. Oracle got the deal. But the big thing is he didn't achieve what he needed to achieve. He has the U.S. user data is going to be held by this new company, but the algorithm behind TikTok is still going to be controlled by the Chinese company and still going to be subject to manipulation by the Chinese government. So the whole rationale behind the deal, the whole reason why we're going to do this, you could say it was overblown, or maybe the fear was not overblown, but the point is that we didn't even achieve that goal. Instead, what we got a sweetheart deal for a Trump supporter. And then the other thing he threw into this at a rally, I think it was a week or so ago in North Carolina, is he said, well, I'm also going to they've agreed to put $5 billion into an education fund, which we're going to use for patriotic education. None of this politically correct anti-American education that the schools are foisting on us. None of the 1619 project. We're going to have our own initiative, from the executive branch pushed by Trump for patriotic education. And I'm going to use this $5 billion fund that I required out of them as a condition for getting approval of this deal. I'm going to use that fund to promote patriotic education. Now, I think you can see the problem with that. What you have is the president of the United States using this vast executive power that he has in order to shake down private companies for a big fund that he's then going to use for promoting educational ideas that are the product of his own initiative, not something that's been approved by any other branch of government or through any kind of normal process of government, basically to promote his personal agenda. Now, the only good news about it, I don't know if it makes it better or worse, is that he's actually probably lying about the $5 billion. Because when he announced it at this rally to his supporters, and they all cheered, and then the company, the ByteDance, which is the Chinese company that created TikTok, said, we've never heard of this. There's a $5 billion fund there's a fund being created, but it may not be $5 billion. And we just thought it was to create online classrooms. So it could be the whole thing is vaporware, that it's just using it as a culture war talking point. But the point is that that's what he considers to be a legitimate, and is promoting as legitimate use of his presidential power, which is to promote his own personal political agenda rather than to serve the interests, go through the lawful channels to serve the interests of the United States. So that's the sort of abuse of power we're talking about. Like I said, a lot of presidents have done this, have pushed in these directions. I think Trump, like I said, he's like every other politician, only more so. He has fewer of the fears and the sort of the inhibitions that would prevent another president from going that far. Other presidents have pushed at this and tried to expand their power and pushed at the edges of things. He's the one who just comes and blasts right through and says, great that you gave me all this power, and now I'm going to just use it blatantly with no regard for the norms and mores and the things that would normally cause a president to discipline himself.
Excellent. So let's go to questions from the audience. So I'm going to read out the questions. So it's going to be Gretchen, Sharon, Sanjay, and Brad next. Folks, if you have questions, you can go ahead and type in the chat and I'll read them out. Start your question with the exclamation mark so I know it's a question. All right, so let's start with Gretchen. Gretchen asks, what checks or assurances are in place to ensure that electorates in their district electors in their district vote according to the actual majority of individual votes?
So I believe there was actually a Supreme Court case recently on this issue of what's called faithless electors. So the electors are, what happens is that there's a slate chosen for each party. That if your candidate wins the majority of, let's say it's a winner take all state. So your candidate wins the majority of the votes in that state. There is a slate of 29 electors who have been chosen. I think they're put forward by the party. They've been chosen as people who will cast their votes on behalf of that candidate. And it's usually something that's sort of given out as a bit of a perk to supporters or functionaries within that party, right? Possibly to donors and people like that. Because you get to be part of this, you get to be part of the Electoral College, part of this grand tradition of electing a president. And so that's your part as this being on the slate of electors. You can see why that would appeal to people. But there have been a couple of cases where there's been something called a faithless elector. And that is somebody who goes in and decides, I'm going to cast my ballot as elector for somebody other than the person I was selected to do. And I believe there was a Supreme Court case recently that says you can't do that. And generally, you can't do that on the first round of voting. So on the second round, you can change, because that was why the Electoral College was done. Is in case if nobody gets a majority on the first round, then the idea is that you're supposed to change. You're supposed to get people to change after this. Let's say you had 270 to 270. We go in to the Electoral College and there's an equal number of electors on each side. Hopefully, one outcome is one of those people could change and say, I'm going to go to 271 on one side and 269 on the other in order to resolve this. But actually, when it was originally created, the idea was that you might have one person has 20% of the vote, another person has 18% of the vote, another person has 22% of the vote. Nobody has a majority. It's just, America was very spread out. They didn't know that they would have such a thing as a national political figure at the time. They thought, well, what if a guy who's big in New England gets all the votes in New England, and a guy who's big in Virginia gets all the votes in Virginia, and a guy who's big in the Deep South gets all the votes from farther down. They were looking forward to that possibility. And so the idea is on the first round, everybody votes for the person they're there as an elector for. On the second round, the horse trading begins, and everybody tries to line up, and hopefully everybody lines up in front, and finally on one of the ballots, enough people line up to give a majority to one person. So that's sort of how the system was originally supposed to happen. And so I think that both by custom and I think also by Supreme Court ruling, they basically said you cannot be a faithless elector. On the first round, you have to vote for the person you were selected to vote for. But the system is designed so that on subsequent rounds, you can change your vote. And particularly if there's a deadlock or no one gets a majority. And that could have happened in previous times. Was it Bill Clinton got 35% of the vote in 1992? There was no, it was split between Clinton, Bush, and it was Clinton, Bush, and the guy whose name I can't remember, but the sort of folksy guy from Texas, I can't remember his name, Ross Perot. Yeah, Clinton, Bush, and Ross Perot. There was a three-way split. So I think that Clinton got it, even with 35%, he got enough electors that he would pretty much won outright. But there was the possibility with a split vote like that, even in the modern day, if you had three parties, that you could then have the need to broker a deal in the Electoral College in order to get enough electors to move over. So it's designed for electors to be able to change, but the safeguard and the rule, and I believe it's a Supreme Court ruling recently, is that no faithless electors on the first ballot.
Okay. Next question is from Sharon. She asks, what can be done to protect the integrity of this election?
Okay, so that's a good question. Now, if like me, you're in a state like Virginia, right? I don't think it matters what I do here with my own voting, because Virginia is like, you know, Biden's up 10 points or something like that. It's not going to be, this is not going to be a swing state in this election. It has been a swing state before. It's not going to be one this time around. So I think they're going to be calling Virginia at 7 p.m. On November 8th. But if you are in a swing state where your vote count, where your vote is likely to, it's likely to be contested, I would say, if you can at all do so, vote in person in some way. But the main thing I would say is push back on this idea of the, in social media, in conversation with friends, and any advocacy you have, push it back against this idea of mail-in ballots being inherently illegitimate. Now, they'll come up with examples of, we found 9 cases over here where there were fraudulent mail-in ballots or something like that. Or they'll talk about vote harvesting schemes, which are a sort of a semi-legal thing where somebody will go out and and go door to door and get people to fill out mail-in ballots, and he'll gather them all in their proper envelopes and deliver them, which is not really illegal, but in some cases it can be kind of pushing the edge of things. It's basically another version of a get out the vote effort, which is not illegal. But generally, the fact is we've done mail-in voting for many years in this country. Absentee voting and mail-in voting we've done for many years. It's not an illegitimate thing. There's nothing inherently fraudulent about it. And this drumbeat that's being created that, no, this is the attempt to steal the election, we can't allow the mail-in voting, that is what creates the basis for the idea that they get away with saying, therefore, let's throw out these ballots and create this crisis where you have a state where, the majority of votes may have been cast for one candidate, but the electors go to the other candidate because of the mail-in voting being used as an excuse. I think if the public doesn't buy that, if the public does not buy that those votes are are fraudulent, then that's when the state officials are going to balk at creating that kind of crisis. They're going to say, I'm not going to, if it's tremendously unpopular and people see that as being, you're stealing the vote away from the legitimate person, then the state legislators are going to balk at that. They're going to know that their interest doesn't go in that direction. And so I think that just pushing back about that idea, and I'm going to put together some resources on this. There's some good reporting has been done about the history of mail-in voting. And I think it's really appalling because, we're in a pandemic, and this is the point at which, rather than casting aspersions on mail-in voting, if the president's going to be doing anything about it at all, he should be saying, let's make mail-in voting work really well this year. Let me advocate that people do it. Let's try to figure out, talk to the various states and figure out the ways we can make it work as smoothly as possible and get the votes counted as quickly as possible. So you should be trying to make mail-in voting work rather than trying to disparage it and make it seem like it's illegitimate.
Okay, the next question is by Sanjay. He asks, we see the arc of behaviors by Republican leaders like Trump to say dangerous words and then claim it was just a joke. Statements like, I may win the third term, are very dangerous in America, yet they are rarely vehemently attacked by other leaders in the media. They often accept the joke excuse. Should leaders or media be calling out such statements?
Well, I think the media is calling it out, but the problem is it's being called out largely along partisan lines. That nobody has to convince the left of center people, just to have their hair on fire about how terrible Trump is. Although I do think there's how would I put it? There's a fatigue that sets in, and I've noticed that for example, everybody's talking today the last day or so, everybody's been talking about Trump's tax returns, because there's this New York Times story about how terrible his tax return, about how, it turns out he's paid $750 in taxes in 2016. This guy who claims to be a billionaire, he's paying $750 in taxes. And the idea is he's gaming the system in various ways to evade taxes. Actually, I think the thing that I took out of it is apparently he's got he's up to his eyeballs in debt and has $300 million of debt that's going to come due in the next couple of years. So while in the middle of his second term, he would be frantically trying to renegotiate $300 million in debt. And you can see the possibility for abuse of power and conflict of interest that comes with that. So what happens though, is that everybody's worked up over the tax returns. So they forget the thing he said last week about the election. And then they forget and when they were talking about the election, they forget the thing he said before that. Somebody just came across, apparently he was giving a speech in Minnesota over the weekend and talked about how much he loves Minnesota because you people have good genes. And it's like breeding it's like breeding horses. You have good genes. And it's basically endorsing eugenics so that we can create, I guess, the perfect Nordic people, because everybody in all the Minnesotans are Norwegian. So we get the perfect Nordic people by having a eugenic program to breed Minnesotans or something like that. And it was just absolutely crazy thing that would generate outrage if any other president said it. But there's so many other things he said that it just sort of gets forgotten. I would have missed it completely if Tim Sandifer hadn't pointed it out. That's something actually I think that is an interesting paradox, an unusual innovation that Trump brought to politics that I hope will not last. But it's something he brought out of social media and reality TV, and frankly, going back and being a tabloid gossip column star in the 1980s. And that is that any other president looks at it and says, if I'm in trouble, that's a problem. I don't want to be in trouble all the time. Because if you're in trouble all the time, you have to keep going back to your supporters to ask them to accept another scandal, another gaffe. You have to get them to overlook it. And you don't want to go back to the well too often. You don't want to ask too much of your supporters. You want them to, every president eventually is going to make a mistake. He's going to say something he shouldn't have said. He's going to have a scandal or something like that. And he's going to have to ask for a little forgiveness and a little forbearance from the American people in general and from his supporters, his core supporters. He's going to say, please go to bat for me and help defend me against this. And usually they say, we don't want to do that too often. We want to, save that for when we really need it and stay out of trouble as much as possible and carefully craft what we say. What Trump realized from, reality TV and professional wrestling and all these other things is that he wants to be in trouble all the time. The more you're in trouble, and the more you have to go back to your supporters again and again and again to back you in some petty little feud that you got into on Twitter with somebody, the more often you do that, the more committed they become to supporting you and making excuses for you as their personal identity, as their lifestyle. So he basically went to reality TV fandom and professional wrestling fandom as his model for how to create a relationship with his political supporters. That these people will be fans of, he put the fanatic in fan, right? That these people will think of themselves as Trump people who are here to back Trump no matter what he says. I think that creates the danger that that new style of politics that I really hope goes away is that the more bad things he does, the more gaffes he says, the more we forget about the last one, and also the more his supporters are conditioned to support him and come up with an excuse for him and everything he does.
Brad asks, I thought that the invalid vote issue was caused by ballots mailed to the unvetted registered voter lists, unfortunately including moved or deceased voters still on the rolls, with no way to confirm the ballot is from a legitimate voter. Contrast this distribution method to absentee ballots, which are requested by a registered voter, a sort of pre-vetting method. Any thoughts?
Okay, so that you're getting something that I want to look into a bit more. I know that different states do it different ways. So, for example, in Virginia, I had to request a mail-in ballot. So it was done in the same way an absentee ballot would be done. There may be states that then send it out to the rolls of registered voters, and it's not necessarily going to the right person. So there will be some error rate on that. But the one thing I want to point out on that, though, is that this is not a new thing. It's not something that hasn't been done before. So there are systems. The system is there, and I'm going to post some links. I found a number of interesting articles where people have gone and they've done reporting on here's what happens with mail-in voting and here's what the error rate is. And it is not a high error rate because you have to sign it, you have to put it into very, the more likely thing actually is that a lot of valid votes are likely to be challenged or to be invalidated because people are terrible at filling out forms. It's the basic problem. So what you get is a lot of these things when you, in some of these cases, you have to send the ballot back in 2 different envelopes, right? So this is to prevent, because this is meant to protect the secret ballot. So the idea is that there's an outer envelope which has your return address and everything on it, and then there's an inner envelope that has no information, and it's supposed to be totally blank and have no information at all, so nobody knows whose ballot this is. And then inside is the ballot that says who you voted for. So the on the outer one is certified that you are who you say you are and you've signed it and all of that, and then the inner one just has the vote to be counted, and it's again to protect the anonymity of your vote, the secret ballot. And that could create a problem because if people don't do that properly, they could think they're sending in their vote, but because they sent it in the wrong envelope or left off one of the envelopes, it then gets rejected. And this is what's called, if anybody remembers the hanging chads, which were the big problem from the 2000 election. They had these a system where you punch a hole, and if you didn't punch the hole completely, it was only slightly punched, and it was called a hanging chad because it was hanging off. And then somebody could contest that and say, well, maybe they didn't mean to punch the hole, and maybe that's why it's hanging, and you shouldn't count the one that's hanging. And what if it's hanging by 2 corners or versus 1 corner? And they had this whole debate. So the hanging chad of this year is likely to be what's called the naked ballot, which is a ballot that's not mailed back in the proper envelope. And there are also other things, like you're supposed to sign it at a certain spot, and people will put the date where they're supposed to sign it, and then they'll sign it where the date's supposed to go. People are terrible at filling out forms. So I think it's more likely that if you have a problem with the mail-in ballots, it's going to be various sort of subjective and questionable ways of invalidating what would have been valid votes.
Arrow asks, aren't there significant valid concerns about the accuracy of registered voter records in multiple states? Are you familiar with the Judicial Watch's Election Integrity Project? They have exposed for years now, with the help of Freedom of Information Act lawsuits against multiple states, massive issues with their voter registration. Any thoughts?
Yeah, we did something similar to this. We had the Tea Party movement about 10 years ago, which is a much happier political time in some ways. And my local Tea Party group, so one of the things that happened with, what do you do when you have the Tea Party group? You have this momentum going. And then what happened in our case, we had a Democrat who'd been elected in Charlottesville, the 5th district in Virginia. He'd been elected by a tiny little margin during Obama's big wave in 2008. And it was clear that this was a guy who was way too far left. I mean, he was like, you brought a character to life out of the fever dreams of the right, because he was worked for a George Soros NGO and went to an Ivy League school. And, just if you wanted to globalist elitist, this guy was the poster child. It was clear that but the thing is, he was clear he was far too left for the district. And so in 2010, he got voted out, which was very predictable. But after that, it was sort of like, well, okay, we have all this excitement and interest in the Tea Party movement. What do we do now? Because we've gotten this seat back for a Republican, small government, relatively small government guy who proceeded not to make us angry for a couple of terms. And so what do we do next? And one of the things they did next was, well, let's work on on this idea of reforms of the voter rolls. And I think that's an excellent thing to focus on, an excellent thing to put an effort into. But the thing is, that's what you do between elections, right? So improving the accuracy of the voter rolls and the registered voter rolls, and making sure that dead people aren't on the list. And I'm from Chicago. They used to say vote early, vote often, and talk about how there have been cases I remember of elections where more votes were cast than the population of the district in which they were cast, and that always brings suspicions that some people who are that there's some shenanigans going on. Those are great concerns to bring up in between the voting, but the irresponsible part, or the dangerous part, is bringing it up when the voting is being counted, because there's really nothing you can do to fix the problem then. All you can do is you can create the extra problem of having uncertainty and illegitimacy in the vote. So, I also, that's one of the things I've been sort of going on about, is everybody says this is the most important election ever and everything's going to be determined by how you vote in November. And one of the problems with that rhetoric is, well, one of them is that we don't always know how important an election is when we're having it. And the other problem is that it puts too much emphasis on what happens on the day you vote, and not enough emphasis on what happens all the days in between, the every 4-year contest. And that's when you really should be focusing on other things on other reforms and other causes. And I think that that the accuracy of the voter rolls and the voter registration rolls and all of that, and the accuracy of the procedures and preventing invalid votes from being cast, those are great things to do in the 3 years, after the November election. But when you get into election year, it's the wrong time. Well, I mean, it's not necessarily always the wrong time to do it, but when you get into election year, it becomes a dangerous thing to then use that as an excuse to say, therefore, the vote's invalid and we're not going to accept it, or to create that possibility for somebody to do that, because then you have, you basically have a problem where there's no way to fix the problem. All it can do is create the new problem of casting uncertainty on the vote and gumming up this whole, all these processes that have to go on in the interregnum between election day and inauguration day. It makes all those, instead of making those things go smoothly, it's like saying, how can we put sand in the works at every available point to try to invalidate it? And that's what I want to argue against.
We're going to take one last question, and then we are going to go for takeaways. So now that's your chance to speak your mind, talk about what you're walking away with from this meetup. So the last question is from Gretchen. She asks, what part could Supreme Court play if Trump contests the results?
Hold on, I missed the first part of the question.
The question is, glitch. What part could the Supreme Court play if Trump contests the results?
Yeah, so 2020 has been a doozy of a year. So we have a big Supreme Court battle here, where Trump is going to appoint, has nominated and is going, and Mitch McConnell is going to push through a new justice for the Supreme Court, within 2 months of the election, within a month or so of the election. And then it's an election where potentially this could go to the Supreme Court the way that Bush versus Gore did. And so it could be, that one of the people appointed by Trump would then end up casting a decisive vote in the Supreme Court's ruling that would then determine who wins the election. So this adds to the stakes here and the possible number of things that could go wrong. I'm not as worried about that, because one of the other, I said there was one good thing that Trump had done with regard to the Constitution, which is not using his reining back the amount that he uses his regulatory power to something outside of trade. The other good thing I should have mentioned is he's generally had good Supreme Court picks. Now, there's things I like or don't like, things I like more or less about his Supreme Court people, and they're not the perfect objectivist justices that I would like to have, but they're generally originalists. They're dedicated to the Constitution, and they are people who are respectable. They're not flunkies. I mean, I think George W. Bush got in trouble because he appointed Harriet Miers, who was like a personal friend of his, who had no particular qualifications as a judge or as a legal scholar or anything like that. He appointed her, and the thing fell flat because even his own party said, "No, we want somebody substantial. We've got all these amazing conservative judges out there, these great scholars. We want somebody much more substantial." I think he ended up appointing for that. I don't know if I remember, it was a Roberts or Alito. I think it may have been Roberts, which would create the extra irony that Roberts has now turned up being sort of one of the new liberal swing vote on the court. So again, these justices' appointments don't always turn out how you like them. But here's where we get to another thing in the Constitution, though, that I think is a great thing, which is, and which has to do with reigning in the power of the president, and that is, thank goodness for lifetime appointments to the court. Because let's say Amy Coney Barrett, he's just nominated for the court, she gets approved in a couple of weeks, which is, I think, very likely the absolute most likely outcome. If she gets approved, here's the thing: she doesn't have to care what Donald Trump or anybody else thinks about her ever again after that, because she's on the court for a lifetime. And we've seen this a lot. I've just mentioned John Roberts. One of the liberal justices on the court now, I think Breyer was, was it Breyer or Souter? One of them was a George H.W. Bush appointee who then became one of the liberal justices, right? So the justices, Supreme Court justices, have this tremendous history of independence in terms of not just political independence, but even ideological independence, where they will move in terms of where they stand from where you guessed they were going to stand when they were appointed. And that's because they have the lifetime appointments, and that insulates them from that political influence. So, I think the people that Donald Trump has appointed to the Supreme Court have been respected jurists with long records as scholars before Trump ever came along, people who are originalists, constitutional originalists. Amy Coney Barrett was a clerk for Scalia and has talked about how his judicial philosophy is my judicial philosophy. So that's, one of the lions of originalism. I have other reservations about her religious views, but I think he's appointed people who are likely to carry on that independence of the judiciary. And, it could be a really interesting irony if he appoints Amy, pushes through Amy Coney Barrett, and she ends up being the swing vote to deny him the election. And that would be an interesting, demonstration of the role of the independence of the judiciary and lifetime appointment of Supreme Court justices in maintaining the checks and balances in that system. So that's something I'm less afraid of. I'm less afraid that it will produce some sort of really awful, politically disruptive result if it goes to the Supreme Court, because the people on the Supreme Court, I have enough of a high opinion of. We'll see if they disappoint me, but I have enough of a high opinion of them that they are not, whatever else I disagree with, that they're not political hacks.
Excellent. So on that note, I'm going to now let everybody have their say. So thank you very much, Rob.